Hello, welcome everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us this evening for our Friday night lecture in conjunction with our special exhibition, Buddha Shiva Lotus Dragon, the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection at Asia Society. On view now at the Kimball through Labor Day weekend, so through September 5th. And if you haven't had a chance to come see the exhibition, I strongly encourage you to not miss it. This is a really wonderful opportunity to see really one of the premier collections of Asian art in the US, of private collections of Asian art, of just the highest aesthetic caliber. It's not a large collection. The initial bequest was about 300 works of art that John D. Rockefeller III and his wife, Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller, made to Asia Society in 1979. And their collection, which they began in the early 50s and collected through the mid 70s, is really unique in not only the high level of quality, but just kind of focusing on certain themes, particularly the ones in the exhibition, which will be Buddhism and Hinduism as they originated in India, and then as these religious systems traveled by land and by sea throughout Asia, and artistic styles were disseminated, and then these cultures would embrace them and bring their own styles to the table. And then also the traditions of ceramics and metalwork in East Asia, again, how technologies and ideas sort of traveled by land and by sea between Asia and the Western world, and how they created just these amazing vessels to further appreciate wine and tea and food and things that were used both in this life and then oftentimes were also included in the tomb to sustain them in the afterlife. So I just, housekeeping reminder to please use the Q&A function. And then at the end of the lecture, we will have some time for questions. I'll moderate questions. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Emma Natalya Stein. Emma earned her BA in art history from Columbia University and MA, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Yale University. She was awarded the Francis Blanchard Fellowship Prize for dissertation distinction, the topic of which was All Streets Lead to Temples, Mapping Monumental Histories in Kanchipuram, circa 8th to 12th centuries. While at Yale, Emma was a graduate curatorial intern at the Yale University Art Gallery, where she co-edited the publication for the exhibition, Gold in Early Southeast Asia. Following consecutive Smithsonian fellowships at the Freer and Sackler Gallery of Art, which is the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C., she became assistant curator of South and Southeast Asian art at the gallery in 2019. In between college and graduate school, Emma was a junior specialist and research consultant in the Indian and Southeast Asian departments at Christie's Auction House in New York. I found this also interesting. She was a research consultant for the Jenny Holzer Studio for a year, providing research on South and Southeast Asian epigraphy. At the Freer Sackler, Emma has two forthcoming exhibitions: Prehistoric Spirals, Earthenware from Thailand, which will be on view this year, and Revealing Krishna, Journey to Cambodia's Sacred Mountain, which will be in 2022. She also has a forthcoming book entitled Constructing Kanchi, City of Infinite Temples, and is the author of numerous articles, catalogs, and book reviews. In addition to her curatorial duties and writing, Emma also lectures widely on the topic of temples in South and Southeast Asia. So I hope you will enjoy her lecture tonight, Walking Among the Gods, Chola Bronzes, and Cambodian Sculpture in Context, which will be illustrated with photographs of fieldwork in India and Cambodia. So welcome, Emma, to the Kimball virtually. I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'll be focusing on two groups of sculptures that are featured in the Kimball's current exhibition, Buddha, Shiva, Lotus, Dragon. These are the magnificent Chola bronzes of South India and the Cambodian stone sculptures from the great temples of Angkor. What I'd like to do is in context around the year would have looked remarkably different than they do today. Understanding how these works of art were originally seen and used will tell us a great deal about how and why their makers made certain choices as they created these divine images. We'll begin in South India and then travel across the sea to Cambodia. During the 9th through 14th centuries, a number of spectacular temple cities were established in India and Southeast Asia. These places were part of a connected world from early in history. By the 6th century, extensive contact between India and Southeast Asia was well established, and merchants, ritual specialists, pilgrims, and military officers circulated goods and ideas across the Indian Ocean. In my research, I focus on connections between the South Indian city of Kanchi and this wider world of temple cities, seen through the lens of art and architecture. Knowing that the places I've marked on this map belonged to an integrated cultural system, we can look at them as a group and compare them. We can also use the partial vestiges of history that still exist in each place to piece together missing information. For example, temple culture and ritual life survives only to varying extents in each place. Some remain active urban ritual centers where people live and work. Others have become more or less archaeological parks with ticketed entries and temples that are monuments more than religious monuments, kind of like open air museums. These places shared certain characteristics during their time of efflorescence, though. They all were royal capitals for ruling dynasties, they had multi-religious populations, and they were all replete with temples that were built of durable materials, primarily stone. Two of these cities were ruled by dynasties that also left us exquisite sculptures. The festival bronzes of the Chola period made in Tamil Nadu, South India, and the sandstone statues that once occupied the inner sanctums of temples in northern Cambodia, like Angkor Wat, are among the most beautiful and sophisticated sculptures in the history of art. And some of the greatest surviving works from these periods are now on view here at the Kimball. Take, for example, these two figures of Lord Shiva. These show us that in India and Cambodia, very different aesthetics developed at the same time. If we were in the gallery, I might ask you to tell me what you see. How do they compare or contrast? You might notice that the Chola bronze figure of Shiva is dynamic and curvaceous, that the body is asymmetrically posed with one leg lifted energetically across the other. His hair extends out to the side as if it's in a divine breeze, and around him is a ring of fire. The Cambodian Shiva instead has a symmetrical column-like form with elegantly sloping contours. He also has 4 arms, but they're held in place, bent tightly at the elbow instead of extended out. His energy is contained internally, instead of pulsating with the energy of a dance. There are also similarities and differences in the two gods' dress and ornamentation. The Cambodian figure's torso is smoothly polished and unadorned. Both wear a textile wrapped around their hips. In Cambodia, it's called a samput, meaning skirt. It's arranged in a series of folds and held in place with a belt that represents jewelry made of gold. The Chola Shiva wears multiple ornaments, including bangles on his arms, ankles, and feet, multi-strand necklaces, a waistband, belts, and rings on 8 of his fingers and 8 of his toes. These also represent ornaments that were made of gold and studded with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and pearls. The most elaborate part of the carving on the Cambodian figure is the hairdo and the crown on the top of his head, another gold ornament here enhanced with expert filigree. Now, the crown also reveals the role of art in religious dynamics that shifted over the course of the 500-year reigns of the Cholas and the Khmer. We call this sculpture Shiva because of the third eye in the center of his forehead, which would have been inset with a sparkling jewel. But notice the abraded mark at the center of his hairdo. It's the outline of a seated Buddha figure that indicates this may originally have been made for a Buddhist context. The image at some point was chiseled off and the third eye was added. These revisions to the sculpture show us that Cambodia was multi-religious, both Buddhist and Hindu, and that patronage shifted at various points in history. Returning to the comparison, what we see is also that despite their apparent differences, both figures exhibit the courtly grace, poise, and celestial beauty that was consistent across South and Southeast Asia. The place I've devoted the most of my fieldwork time is the South Indian city of Kanchipuram, called simply Kanchi, in the state of Tamil Nadu. Today, it's a Hindu pilgrimage town, and it's also the place that Indian women come to purchase the perfect wedding sari. The day has a kind of cyclical rhythm where visitors flood into the city in the morning and visit temples, then retreat to the air-conditioned sari shops in the midday heat, and return to visiting temples after 4 p.m. when they reopen after a siesta. In the evening, after the sun goes down, the city quiets and the streets return to its residents. Religious festivals are a constant part of life in this city of 1,000 temples, as it's popularly known. When they take place, the temple hosting the celebration becomes extra lively, colorful, and sonorous. Local residents and devotional tourists share the temple throughout the day and well into the night, performing special deeds of offering called puja to the gods inside the sanctums. Here our sculptures enter the scene. Festivals very often include carrying a bronze image of a deity in an elaborate procession. In fact, beginning in the Chola period, about a century before the year 1000, bronze images began to be made specifically for this form of public devotion. Rather than staying in their inner sanctums, like stone images, bronze images were carried right on outside of the temple and through the city streets. In order to bring the god into the public gaze, it had to be prepared first. So first it was bathed in sacred fluids like milk and clarified butter, and then dressed in fresh silk garments and adorned with real versions of the kind of jewelry that we saw replicated on the 2 sculptures of Shiva. At one especially large festival at a popular temple in Kanchi, the goddess Kamakshi was carried out into the city and then around the entire massive complex in a golden chariot. It was pretty impressive. The chariot looked like a glowing orb of divine light surrounded by a throng of devotees. Throughout the 10-day festival, yes, it lasted for 10 days, a special shrine was set up for bronze images of 3 versions of the goddess. Priests chanted prayers more or less continuously and performed special rituals, and sacred food was served to anyone who came to participate, often by the festival's sponsor, as a way to spread the merit that they were earning by being a patron. In Hinduism, the images are believed to be the gods, and the act of seeing, and more importantly, being seen by that god confers blessing. This divine exchange of gazes is called darshan. Processions make it possible for the greatest number of people to have darshan in the most efficient amount of time. Not everybody can get into the temple at the same time to see a god, but if the god is on the move, people can come out of their houses and see it and be blessed. Now, Kanchi is a city that feels like it's been specially designed for religious processions. This is a map of the city showing the temples that were built during the era of the Pallava and the Chola dynasties, roughly 13th centuries. You don't need to worry about the details, but notice how temples are peppered throughout the landscape, and the city seems to squeeze between them. Streets either circle around or lead between temples, the perfect theaters for processions. Some processional routes are deeply etched into the city's history. Here's a bronze image of Vishnu being carried from the largest of his temples in town, past several other Vishnu temples where he'll stop to visit other versions of himself, and then along a road that leads onwards north out of the city 100 kilometers to a holy pilgrimage destination called Tirupati. Inscriptions from as early as the Chola period mention this road, and they talk about pilgrims and processions that regularly made the long journey between Kanchi and Tirupati. Now, the thing is, Kanchi isn't shaped like what's known as a typical temple town in Tamil Nadu. Here's an example of a more usual design. So this is not Kanchi, it's another place called Tiruvannamalai, a much smaller place. But Tiruvannamalai is a more standard form in that it has a single central temple complex at the heart of the town, and the residences and commercial areas cluster around the temple. In the temple itself, the main sanctum is located at the very center and is the lowest structure in the complex, so you can't quite see it in the picture. It's surrounded by a series of concentric square enclosure walls that are entered through gateways topped with towering pyramidal structures. Between the enclosure walls are gardens, pools of water, shelters for visitors, and shrines for subsidiary deities. The towers of the gateway are visible from anywhere in the town, and streets lead directly to those gateways, which are aligned in the cardinal directions. This temple was established some 1,200 years ago, and it's been built up over time ever since, with continuous expansions, renovations, and additions happening. The result is that nearly nothing of the original structure survives. But not all temples continued this way as active centers of devotion. In the region of the Kaveri River, farther south in Tamil Nadu, dozens of shrines survive that have gone relatively untouched. Many just serve as the local village shrine. They're not an open-air museum. The blue points on this map represent temples that I've personally visited, but there are even more. Some of these temples have become archaeologically preserved monuments. At this 10th century temple, for example, the only significant change is that the brick roof has been reconstructed and covered in plaster. The preserved monuments allow us to see the beauty of Chola period stone sculpture on their exterior walls. But Chola era artisans are far better known for their expertise in bronze casting. It's rare to find Chola era bronzes in temples today. In Kanchi, despite the plethora of temples, there are absolutely no early bronzes in the city. The bronzes used in processions like these two were made much more recently, usually any time from as the earliest 17th century, but right on up until the present. Why should this be? One reason for the absence of early bronzes is a general preference for the new rather than the old. If an image of a god becomes damaged, it's often deconsecrated, so taken out of ritual use, disposed of in a proper fashion, and replaced with one that's newly made. Theft is another way that bronzes disappear from temples. But the most widespread reason lies in an ancient custom of burying valuables in times of instability or threat. I thank Vidya for identifying this process. During the Chola period, temples grew into vast, wealthy estates that housed impressive caches of precious jewelry and bronze sculptures. When the empire started to crumble, priests looked to protect the temple valuables. They followed tradition and buried the bronzes in carefully laid pits underground. Typically, only the most senior members of the priesthood knew the location of the bronzes. Eventually, they died off or relocated, and the knowledge was lost. Today, farmers still find these caches of bronzes buried in fields. There are, of course, exceptions. Here's one example from another temple in the Kaveri region. You can see that even though they're resting in their sanctum, here the figure of Shiva and goddess Uma are well attired. When we see Chola bronzes in museums, they look quite different from how they appear when they're in use. But you can see how they were made specifically with processions in mind. On this bronze, loops on the side of the base are still present. They would have been fitted with poles and attached to a transport for a procession. So by doing fieldwork and seeing these gods on the move, we can see that the same kinds of processes are still in the works. So there are poles attached to a transport, which then will be hoisted up onto the shoulders of priests and initiated devotees, and they will carry the bronze in procession. Each sculpture was equipped with these loops or with holes in front of the base. The sculptures were made in segments through a process of lost wax casting. Each segment begins as a wax figure made of beeswax and resin. This wax model should include all the details of jewelry and embellishments that will appear on the final bronze. The wax is then packed in clay that has openings called sprues. It's heated, and the wax is melted out, leaving the clay mold intact. And then a molten mixture of copper alloys, is poured in through the sprues. As it cools, the bronze solidifies inside. When the clay mold is cracked open to free the figure, the mold is destroyed and no identical sculpture can be produced. This means that every bronze image made in this way is entirely unique. The largest segment of the sculpture is the body, which is cast solid and includes a thin disc-shaped base under the feet, right here. The base is cast separately and it's hollow. The disc beneath the figure's feet is set into the top of the lotus-shaped pedestal while the bronze is still warm. And then the lip of the lotus is folded down and hammered to secure the figure to the base. The prongs on the sides support the flaming aureole, like we saw in the Shiva Nataraja. It's often missing because it's cast separately and isn't attached by anything particularly strong. In museums, we also get to appreciate the brilliance of these beautiful sculptures, just as the Chola era patrons did when they commissioned the images in order to gift them to temples. In this figure of goddess Uma, also called Parvati, from the Rockefeller collection, we see an elegantly swaying torso, a lithe, attenuated waist, crisp contours of garments that fan out to the sides as she moves, and a sense of beauty, poise, and restraint. The ornaments that she would be adorned with are also cast directly onto her body, because in India, it's believed that the body is complete only when wearing ornaments. So remember, every little detail must have been carved onto the wax figure that was the model for this sculpture in order for it to appear as part of the bronze. The only actual garment she wears is a tightly fitting veshti, also called a dhoti. It's like the sampot. It's a single piece of cloth wrapped around her hips and pulled through her legs to create a kind of pant skirt. It's held up with a series of belts, including one with a clasp in the shape of a makara, or auspicious mythical sea creature. Her earrings are also in the shape of makaras, and her head is crowned with a multi-tier headdress with strands of pearls forming an arc across her forehead. Her face follows all the conventions of courtly, poetic beauty and comportment, with almond-shaped eyes that poets say are like fish, full lips, and a long, straight nose. Same standards of beauty hold true for these two magnificent of Saints Sambandar and Manikavachakar. These two characters likely lived during the 6th and 9th centuries, respectively, and they wrote hymns of praise for Shiva and Uma. Their poems often describe the god and goddess's body, including their ornaments. Both of these figures are believed to have abandoned their lives in order to devote themselves fully to Shiva. They did this by traveling across the Tamil countryside, visiting temples, and in each place they composed a poetic hymn. It's common to hear devotees sing these hymns in front of temple sanctums today, singing to the gods. Saint Sambandar, on the left, was just a child when he became a complete devotee. He's shown in his characteristic dancing position, perpetually reenacting the moment of his revelation. His story is preserved in an anthology called the Periya Puranam that was composed in the 12th century under royal Chola patronage. As it is told, Sambandar's father took him to a temple one day and left the little boy alone by the side of the ablutions pool while he went to take a ritual dip. When the father returned, he found the boy playing with a golden bowl, a dribble of milk coming off the side of his lips. When his father asked where he got this souvenir, Sambandar pointed up to the temple tower where there was an image of goddess Uma. Then he started dancing and burst into song. According to the story, the father picked the boy up onto his shoulders and carried him just like this to any temple that he wanted to visit across all of Tamil Nadu. And Sambandar left us a great, great number of poetic hymns to Shiva and Uma. Let's now leave this land of hymns and festival bronzes and travel across the sea to Southeast Asia, where a very different aesthetic tradition of sculpture and architecture was underway at the very same time as the reign of the Cholas. During the 9th through 14th centuries, Cambodia and parts of what today are neighboring countries was ruled by the Khmer Kingdom. Like the Cholas in South India, their royal capitals became multi-religious temple cities that boasted large and prolific sacred architecture. Known worldwide as the temple called Angkor Wat. But as you'll know if you've been there, Angkor Wat itself is just one of about 40 surviving temples within a single once urban expanse. The colossal temple called Bayon is a Buddhist monument that is much less known than Angkor Wat, but no less impressive. Looking at satellite imagery reveals the expanse of the city. I know, you have to do a lot of work to imagine that this was once a city. Today, it's covered in jungle overgrowth, so we see a lot of green. The points marked on the map represent temples. It's a bit hard to see, but know that as in Kanchi, there are dozens. The big difference is that today, none of them are active sites of devotion, at least not in the way that they were originally intended. There are also plenty of temples outside of the urban core, such as one known as Preah Khan of Kampong Svay. I've left us in the picture so that you can see the temple's massive scale. This once grand causeway leading into the complex is today nearly consumed by the environment. Angkor's temples have been radically transformed by nature over the course of the last 1,000 years. That said, There are ways in which the temples were always intentionally connected with that same natural environment that today consumes it. Many of them seem to be emplaced so that they have a relationship with the rising or setting sun. This picture shows the temple at 5:30 in the morning. Look at how the first light of day illuminates the monument. These doors lead into sanctums that originally faced east towards the rising sun and contained sculptures of gods. It was no coincidence that they were positioned in this manner. Similarly, the vast reservoir called Sra Srang also brilliantly reflects the sunrise. Here it is on an especially dramatic morning. But imagine how many mornings have looked just like this over the course of the last 1,000 years. Khmer builders are known for their expansive moats, reservoirs, and other waterworks. I've marked just a few for you on the map, most of which no longer function. An exception is the moat around Angkor Wat, which still holds water and is one of the reasons sunrise at the temple is so spectacular. The scholar Eleanor Manica has explored the way the sun gradually shines into and symbolically activates various parts of Angkor Wat throughout the day. The sun would have enlivened many other temples and all those other water bodies too. Now, what was the position of sculpture in all this? Generally speaking, there are two types of Cambodian temples. Some are horizontally laid out like this, where several sanctums are positioned side by side, each housing a different single icon. The more elaborate version of this type stretches out in multiple directions, and a visitor or devotee would encounter freestanding deities at the juncture of galleries and relief carvings of celestial female figures along the walls. The other basic type is pyramidal. There's a convention that Khmer kings could sponsor the construction of as many horizontal temples as they wanted, but they could only build one pyramid-shaped temple. Here's the earliest example of that type. It dates to the beginning of the 9th century, but the main tower was built or rebuilt in the 11th century. An iconic sculpture would have occupied the upper chamber. I'm using this goddess from the Rockefeller collection just as an example. This particular goddess wouldn't have been in this particular temple because it's dedicated to Shiva and was built earlier than the sculpture was made. But it's helpful to have a sense of architectural context. Whatever sculpture was at the center would have held a vantage point high above the surrounding settlement. The god or goddess would have looked out over the landscape, symbolically surveying and reigning over their domain. I mentioned earlier that a key way to tell the date of a Khmer sculpture is by the arrangement of the sampot, or the skirt that the figure wears. Remember the garment that our Chola Uma wore, with sashes fanning out to her sides, and it was pulled up between her legs. Khmer skirts typically hug the body in a column-shaped form, or for male deities, they're also pulled up between the legs. Here you can see the contrast between the two goddesses, just by their garments. They may well both represent the same goddess, Uma, but look at the change in the skirt that took place during the century between when they were made. The sculpture on the right, made in the 10th century, has a wide fold over the top of the garment. The one on the left, made in the 11th century, has the whole top of the skirt pulled up flush against her body. The Rockefeller Shiva was also made in the 11th century, and look at the top of the skirt, flush up against the body again. Cambodian sculpture is classified not only by date, but by style. This is done by correlating the freestanding sculptures with relief carvings on existing temples. In general, Styles are named after pyramidal temples, not horizontal ones, because pyramidal temples are considered state temples. This sculpture is called Bathwand Style because of the temple of Bathwand, built in the 11th century, right in the urban core in the city of Angkor. The stylistic name does not mean that the sculpture came from that particular temple. After all, we've already seen that this was probably a Buddhist deity, and Bathwand is dedicated to Shiva. But if we look at reliefs at the temple of Bathwand, we notice that the garment is exactly the same. Now, while we have this relief in front of us, I'd like to draw your detail at the upper right of the panel, a standard, a bronze image on top of a staff. This detail shows us how bronze sculptures were also used during the Khmer Empire. We find similar images pretty frequently in reliefs. Here's one of my favorites. At the Temple of Ta Prohm, there's a relief panel that shows a battle standard with a bronze figure of Hanuman, the Monkey King from the ancient Indian epic Ramayana. An actual bronze also survives from Cambodia, made in the very same period as the relief carving. In this image, Hanuman lifts his leg, preparing to make the giant leap from South India to Sri Lanka to rescue the captive Princess Sita. Imagine what this would have looked like to an approaching enemy in battle, its gilt surface gleaming in their faces, like the god was really alive. So we see here that bronzes in South India were used in religious processions, but in Cambodia, they were used in military ones. The reliefs at Angkor Wat, Bayon, Ta Prohm, and other temples reveal much about imported mythology and local daily life. Angkor Wat's reliefs line extensive galleries, stretching on seemingly interminably as you walk around. Apsaras, celestial female figures, peek around from every corner. A devotee's visit to the temple would have entailed a long walk through these cloistered enclosures, passing the interior walls lined with reliefs. This type of encounter would have been their way to walk among the gods. So we've come a long way between India and Southeast Asia, Tamil Nadu, and Cambodia. And I hope that seeing how these sculptures were used reveals something about why these two very different aesthetics developed in different places, but at the same time. The South Indian bronze is dynamic, made to be on the move, just as at least some bronze images were in Cambodia. The Cambodian stone sculpture is meant to be rooted in place, positioned in the sanctum of a temple. Both figures wear similar garments, but arranged according to local custom and preference. The figure itself adheres to ideals of courtly beauty that were widespread and shared across a connected world of architecture and sculpture. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was wonderful. I mean, you really brought these pieces to life. I think we, when we see them in a museum context, obviously we're missing, how they were used and viewed when they were made and in their lifetime. So you really brought them to life. Let's see. Does anyone out there in the audience have questions? Because I have no questions at the moment. So I hope somebody will ask some questions. Oh, here, there's some, hang on a second. Use the Q&A if you can, please. Emma, are you there?
Yes, I'm still.
Okay. Wondering if the temples in South India were ever not painted.
Were ever not painted. So paintings survive in some portions of temples in South India that are covered or protected from monsoon climates. A temple in Kanchi called Kailasanatha, which is very well preserved, does have vestiges of the paint, but paint surviving is quite rare. So to what extent it covered every surface, especially the exteriors, we don't necessarily know at this point. There are some examples where you can see painting on the exterior walls of Chola temples. At Tribhuvanam, I believe, is one. But I don't think that I would feel comfortable giving an answer to say that temples were always painted, because even if we start with that assumption, we'll probably find an exception. I found with studying Indian art and architecture, it's really dangerous to say the words always and never. Most of the time, as soon as you think you've identified something that happens everywhere all the time, you find an exception right away. I hope that's helpful.
Right. Kind of in the same vein, and I'll try to combine two questions. So images of statues that you showed us dressed in silks, were the statues ever painted? So I guess they're asking if these bronze statues, the Chola statues, were ever painted, and also why were the bronzes adorned with flowers, etc.?
Okay, so in order to properly prepare a bronze for procession, or even just to show devotion to an image that isn't going to move, one of the most important processes is called Abhisheka, which is this ritual bathing. So I showed one picture of that, but so many different substances can be placed over the body of the god to confer blessing. So it would have been impractical to paint these images, right? Because they're constantly being bathed, and between each substance is a bath of water. And I think that's something that usually doesn't get described, but that I found striking, by actually watching these ceremonies, is that if milk is poured, then water to wash that off. Yogurt, then water to wash that off. In some cases, pomegranate juice, then water to wash that off, right? So this constant act of bathing is one of the reasons why we have the Ganesh right here in the title slide. Notice how soft the front of the trunk is, and the eyes, the details that have a kind of crispness lower down in the body have worn off there. And some of that is from this constant act of lustration over the bronze. So typically, no, they wouldn't have been painted because it would be impractical. Sometimes you do see sacred powder placed on the foreheads. More you see that in stone sculpture. This act of this follows into the second question: why were the bronzes adorned with flowers and silks, etc.? This act of offering to the body of the god, to the physical presence embodied in a sculpture, is devotion. That's how to show devotion. And so flowers, silks, jewelry, these are things that enhance the beauty of the god, that are valued, that are used widespread throughout ritual, and that are specifically connected with temples. Starting in the 13th century, there are many, many inscriptions that talk about allocating land within temple properties for flower gardens, specifically to cultivate flower gardens, so that the flowers could then be used in the ritual offerings, right? So it's a kind of connected world, even within this microcosm of the temple, between the sculptures and the objects that then are offered to them, and food as well, which is exchanged.
Very good. This is a good question. Other than perhaps being more lifelike, is there any special significance to the dynamic qualities of the sculptures?
So the whole aesthetic of South Indian bronzes is about this kind of negotiation between movement and stillness. And some of that idea of movement is about the power of the god. There's one interpretation of the enclosure walls around temples that they're meant to contain, not just to protect from the outside, but to contain the energy and power of the god inside the sanctum, that without those walls, it would just burst. And so I think the same thing is kind of at work in the images, that within a single image of a god, there's always this potential for a kind of explosive energy that shows their divine eminence and their power and the magnitude of their
Are you there? You you
yeah.
kind of froze for a minute, so
Okay.
I think it's okay. You pretty much finished it. I think I can answer this question. I think you answered it in your talk, but just to confirm, are these types of statues still being made for temple use? And I think the answer is yes. Yeah. Here's a question about the Shiva Nataraja and the demon that he's trampling under his foot. Can you talk a little bit more about that demon?
Sure, and maybe since we have this up, he's right there. So it's always better to look at an image while we're talking about it, right? So again, as everything, there are different interpretations. One common one is that he is, Shiva is trampling the kind of demon of illusion or delusion or ignorance. The actual Sanskrit name for this figure means forgetfulness. It translates to forgetfulness. So maybe that's one kind of obstacle that that all of us face. Gets also, it gets interpreted and extrapolated to mean ignorance more broadly. An interpretation that I quite like is that the demon is actually a kind of devotee, and he is serving as a support for Shiva's foot. So Shiva is associated with these little figures called ganas. You may have heard of Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, is the lord of the ganas. So around him are often these little figures. And so this demon is also a kind of gana. And he can be seen as a devotee of Shiva who knows that gods should not walk directly on the ground. That's why they're always, there's the word always, but they are usually positioned over a lotus-shaped base or some kind of pedestal, usually a lotus. And so this gana is trying to even get between the lotus base and Shiva's foot just to elevate him a little bit more. So there are various interpretations.
Great, thank you. Is Cambodia still both Hindu and Buddhist?
It's a good question. Cambodia primarily is Buddhist now, and many of the Hindu temples, including Angkor Wat itself, which is dedicated to Vishnu originally, have been reused as Buddhist monuments, and there are even Buddha shrines set up within the Hindu temples. At Bathwand, the earliest pyramidal temple that I showed you an example of today, there's a Buddhist monastery right next door, and the monks often come to the temple and circumambulate it and perform various offerings to the deities and to the images, even though it's originally a Shiva temple, a temple dedicated to Shiva. But Cambodian Buddhism is inflected very much with this Hindu history, and so there are many Buddhist pilgrimage destinations on the tops of hills and mountains in Cambodia where local people go, and one of the things that they do is they bathe a linga in water. And a linga is a sign of Shiva. It's a representational symbol of Shiva. And an act of devotion to it is by pouring water over it. So there's a kind of cistern next to it, and you can pour the water. But they see this as part of their practice, right? And they wouldn't identify it as necessarily Hindu. Okay.
So here's a very specific question. When is the 10-day festival in Kanchi?
Okay, so that one was not something that happens annually. It's a good question. There are many festivals that do happen annually. For example, there's Navaratri, which is it happens throughout India, but is a 9-day festival to the goddess, which takes place in the fall. It's lunar calendar, so the dates vary. But that particular festival that I showed images of was sponsored by an individual family from Hyderabad who actually came to Kanchi to do that particular festival at that particular temple in consultation with the priests. And for that one, they even brought priests from Tirupati, that place 100 kilometers away, because those were the priests who knew how to do that particular ritual. It was a very complex one. So it's not something that happens all the time. It was a very special occasion. I feel very lucky to have been there doing field work at the time that it was taking place.
Let's see. Maybe I have time for a couple more. Do we know if live human models were used to create the sculptures?
We do not know.
And here's another one. So what is the most common temple image in South India and in Cambodia? For example, I'm not knowing what Arkabera Atsavabera, Balibera. Maybe you know what they're asking. I'm not entirely sure.
So I can't actually see the Q&A, so I'm not sure. But what's the most common image? I also wouldn't feel comfortable answering.
Yeah.
Probably Shiva. Some manifestation of Shiva. If you want a more specific answer, yeah.
Exactly. Sorry. Let's see. Scrolling through. Well, I'll answer this one. Does this remind you of the procession of statues of saints in Italy, Spain, or Mexico? Yes.
I would agree with you. Yes.
Absolutely.
Or Russian icons as well.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interest. So do we know if South Indian bronzes were dressed in fine cottons as well as silks?
Oh, it's a good question. Probably. I did say silk, and typically you see silk saris now because they're kind of special. But it's very possible. I would want to look at texts, or turn to my colleagues who work on texts that describe rituals, and
Right.
describe the actual objects or the substances that should be used, and see what word is used for fabric. If it is chini, which is silk, or if it's something else, or if it's something more generic. But that would be a way to. But it's an interesting question that I'd like to follow up on. Yeah,
Right. I actually have a question. So on the Ganesha, I thought that the tangs that are coming up from the base were for hanging garlands of flowers off of when it's being processed. But you said it's actually part of the base of what was originally the halo behind.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I have always understood them that way. That those are prongs because of what we see with surviving ones.
Mm-hmm.
That the aureole kind of goes around them, and and slides over the prongs and then is attached. But it's possible that they had multiple purposes. It's also possible, since so many bronzes do not have their oriels anymore, that it was literally a separately affixed piece that was not connected permanently, and that it was used sometimes, or that not everyone had one.
Okay. Well, someone in the audience says that the tongs hold Tiruvasi. Don't know. Okay. Are you still there, Emma?
Yes, I'm so.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Lots of good questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Emma, so much for preparing a really wonderful lecture. Again, bringing these things to life and giving us a much better understanding of how they functioned and were used originally, which we don't always get in a museum context. So thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And again, if you haven't had a chance to come see the exhibition, please do come visit before September 5th. All right, so thank you and good night, everyone.